case, a Islamic State, as one would think, for example. There were some people who did express this idea, but generally people felt that it would have to be some kind of a neutral state, some kind of, if they would be more religiously inclined, some kind of an ecumenical state as such. So this is perhaps the first example. I hope it is clear enough, because I've narrowed it down, at least summarized it, to speak about a kind of discussion or debate that goes on over a long period of time, where people are debating politics, or at least discussing politics, in the context, first of all, of a broader political question about the future constitutional writing, as well as a debate, or at least a contentious debate between Muslims and Christians. Let me catch breath, and then if you have a question, maybe you can ask them. I want to move on to a slightly different kind of Muslim public, and this is a Muslim public that has to do with halal certification. I don't know if you have that in Belgium, or you probably have seen that here around somewhere. But this is the practice among a number of Muslim countries. In fact, I think that South Africa is one of the leading countries, but you see that increasingly in Netherlands as well. I remember when I was here in the Netherlands until 2006, I hardly ever saw food or so carrying a stamp that this is halal or this is permissible for Muslims to eat or to consume. Although 2 years later, as I've been coming back to Europe, for example, I've noticed that in Germany, I've also noticed that in the Netherlands as well. I don't know yet about Belgium, or whether it takes place in Leuven as well. Now, the context of halal certification here, talking about in South Africa, was this was the subject of a study by one of my students, who actually tried to see where did this originate from? How did it come about that Muslims started to demand certification for their foods, and what was the nature, what was the implication of the certification as such? Well, the tendency, or at least the tradition, developed in South Africa exactly from 1985. It was the first time that he identified that a halal stamp was put over margarine. You know what's margarine? Kind of, right? Margarine is not a non-meat product. It's not a meat product, but the first time that before that, Muslims were always concerned about whether food, meat products are actually halal or not. But this was a non-meat product that had a stamp on it as such. Now this is related in general to the development of food processing. Food processing is new technologies in the development of food. It has actually now picked up, as you probably know, in a radical way. I mean, there's a lot of debates and discussion about what are the kinds of things, what do we eat that we are on. But this emerged within the Muslim context in South Africa around the production of food. It also coincided with the upwardly mobile emergence of Muslim middle classes who were no longer living in territories or in areas that were confined by Muslim communities. It also related to the modernization of the abattoirs in Cape Town and in South Africa in general. When the abattoirs were more centralized, by the decree of the state, that actually put a pressure on Muslims to reorganize, to think about, okay, now the question arose that in this new kind of context, when you have to go to a supermarket or you go to a restaurant, because you have now the ability to do that, are you permitted to eat the food, or particularly the meat that is served to you at the time? And so the question emerged among Muslims, and it's a debate that goes on almost internationally, but in South Africa in particularly, is it permissible to eat this kind of food that is coming out from the new food production lines and this new kind of economy that is emerging from the 90s, 80s onwards as such? The upshot of that was, in South Africa, what emerged out of this need, or at least out of this discussion, were what the student has called halal authorities. Authorities emerged, or at least people who declared that they could actually go out and investigate whether which food is halal, which food is not permissible, and they could actually, for a small fee, they could put a stamp onto it. Now, obviously, they were taking this idea from the Jewish people have been doing that for a long time. But what is interesting to see is that this is the time that people who claim to have knowledge about religious law and also knowledge about food production combining together in order to produce a kind of certification. In South Africa, it was so successful that from 1985 till now, over the period of 20 odd years, you have 4 different authorities competing with each other, very much like a market economy about who certifies food better than anybody else. And on the slide there, I've put the logos of the 4 organizations that represent sort of the leading authorities. They not only certify food for people in South Africa, but they also certify sometimes their expertise is also required on a global level as well. Now, the result of this is that, as followed in the study, is that what I've shown you here on just one slide, perhaps it's a bit too little, but at least sufficient, that this is a kind of newspapers that were generated within the broader society, sent through emails, sometimes sent through SMSs, all kinds of media that were used in order to promote them. And there was a close relationship built between consumption and religious identity. To the extent that one can say this Muslim publics produce consumer identities. You might know, for example, you might have heard in anthropology, for example, this is a new area of recognition of the development of consumption, and identities are very closely connected with each other. If you just walk down the streets in Belgium or anywhere, any of the big cities, any city in South Africa, not in South Africa, in the world, for example, you can see the development of consumption identities. So while Muslims might be appearing to be turning away to religion, what they're actually producing are consumption identities based on religious ideas or religious symbols as such. And secondly, the second impact of this kind of Muslim public is the emergence of new authorities. These authorities were religious scholars, scholars who were trained in Islamic law, but then retool themselves, supplement the information with understanding of food technology, modern food technology, and therefore at least introducing this kind of certification as such. To the extent, as I told you, nowadays it started off with margarine, but it's not unusual in South Africa to find milk, water, everything actually being certified as such. I mean, one can discuss that and one can talk about that, but I think at least one can see the promotion and the productive nature of this kind of Muslim public as such. Okay, I want to turn to a slightly different kind of context, and maybe in terms of time I might have to just move on some of these slides, but let me turn to something very specific to Cape Town now. Previously I was speaking about halal authorities which are general within South Africa, but this is, in fact this other side that I'm looking at is also a very interesting study that was done in Cape Town on interfaith marriages in Cape Town. Now I think in order to understand interfaith marriage in Cape Town, I have to add a little bit of a background to this. This comes in the context of a history of very close relations between Muslims and Christians in Cape Town, particularly from people who are considered to be colored. They are neither white nor black. Also, they are from some of them are from at least from older origins of the original inhabitants of Cape Town. Many of the Muslims come from coming from Indonesia, islands of Indonesia, or from the east during the 17th and 18th century. But the history is very closely tied with each other. During apartheid, as such, they were identified as colored. They were made as one particular group, but they developed very distinctive identities from each other. In a sense, in the context of apartheid, the religious identities became much more clearly demarcated from each other. It means Muslims turned towards the mosque in large numbers, and Christians turned towards the churches as such. And when South African society, or particularly Cape Town society, began to become open during the 1980s, during the last decade against apartheid. In addition, in 1994, when the first democratic election was held in South Africa, that opened up the spaces, not completely within South Africa, significant spaces between people as such. And one of the results of that was to see an increasing number of interfaith marriages in Cape Town. So, one of my students basically undertook the task of looking at what are the debates about interfaith marriages. Is it accepted within the religious society? What is being said or what is not being said? How do the people who are married, with two different kinds of religious backgrounds, how do they actually manage as such? Now, what she found, interestingly, I thought I might find her here, but she's actually a student, a master's student here at Leuven. So I hope to see her tomorrow or maybe in the next day or so. So I don't see her here right now. Okay, what were the responses of Muslims? What are the kind of Muslim publics on this particular phenomenon? It's a smaller phenomenon, but it's a growing phenomenon. Initially, in fact, she found it very difficult to identify the people, but soon she was able to, and then it just snowballed, and since then we've begun to see much more of this as such. Well, there was a lot of resistance to such marriages from Muslim religious leaders, religious radio stations, basically just simply advocated against it. They were not really keen on carrying out these marriages as such, or at least performing in the marriages between two partners as such. But slowly and there was also resistance from families. So on the one hand, there was a very strong Muslim identity in this case. I'm not qualified to speak about the Christian identity, but because we were looking at the Muslim debates about this, but there was a very strong resistance, putting a lot of pressure on these kind of marriages as such. But having said that, though, what also was very clear in the research is that, first of all, there was a steady increase. There was no public debate, but it was an increasing practice that people that were participating, or at least that engaging in these marriages, were just simply going ahead, still maintaining a very strong, sometimes very strong religious identity, sometimes not a strong religious identity. But it was very interesting to see that how people were negotiating the religious identity in the context of a strong censure of these kind of marriages. So here, it's the point I wanted to make, the example, what I'm citing here is that Muslim publics is supposed to be a strong discourse against the marriage, a lot of pressure against the marriage, but individuals themselves are not necessarily inhibited from doing that as well. And that perhaps alludes to what the scholars earlier, what I mentioned, that the possibilities that are presented in the new political context leads people to do things that are not necessarily in conformity with what is done, what is demanded of them from the outside. Okay, let me move out of Cape Town, and I want to look at a particular another important site, that is radio and television in Ghana. Here, this was a particular study of the emergence of very strong, both Christian and Muslim radio stations, Christian and Muslim television stations. Birgit Meyer from University of Amsterdam has done a study of a lot of the Christian media in Ghana. In fact, she has made some interesting comments about what the media means in Ghana. So it was quite fitting. I thought that we should actually do a close study of the Muslim media as well. The study was done by a Nigerian student of mine, and I'm sort of sharing with you some of his findings. So he studied the Ghanaian radios, basically traced it all the way back to 1935 when the first radio stations were introduced. Later in the 1950s, television was introduced as well. But in the very earlier period until the 1990s, generally both radio and television were controlled by the state. First by the colonial state, and then later by the post-colonial independent state as such. Again, similarly, interestingly, with the 1990s, liberalization generated a new discourse, at least a new demand for more liberal spaces as such. But the state allowed that. They passed new laws for more, for giving licenses to private individuals, for commercial as such. But it was decided not to give licenses to religious groups, because the fear was that religious groups would actually antagonize each other, and therefore they would compromise the health of the nation as such. Religious groups, however, were allowed to buy time on radio stations and television stations as well. And therefore, in 2010, when the student did field work in Ghana, we found a lot of radio stations, a lot of televisions, actually very strong religious identities, very strong religious content, but officially they were either commercial radio stations that were non-religious, or they were even state radio stations that were not necessarily promoting religions. What did you find in these radio stations? It's significant. One, what would expect, the radio and television, the state, there's still a strong state in radio and television, so they were basically promoting state values, national values of development. How can one think about religious values in order to alleviate poverty or maybe deal with the issues of the state? Okay, allowing, in terms of the Muslim radio stations, particular entrepreneurs or people who are very successful in Ghanaian societies were now speaking about Islam. This is what Islam requires of you, to get a job, to get an education, and to actually contribute to the development of the society. At the same time, though, The commercial radio stations also somewhat follow that line, but when we looked much more closely at the Muslim radio stations, what we also noticed is that there was a particular religious group, religious students, or students who had graduated from Arab countries, or in particular Saudi Arabia, to a lesser extent other parts, but Saudi students who had come back to Ghana. They had already come back in the 1960s and 70s and had not made much headway within the Ghanaian society. But when radio and television stations were liberalized as such, it was these groups who basically took advantage of the kind of opportunities presented by the radio and television, and therefore began to promote, in terms of the religious content of the radio station, a much more austere program, a much more puritanical tradition. Now this is a very significant, I think, finding as such, because it has normally been expected that radio and television would be open and liberalization would actually be opening up the Broadway. So what in Ghana you find two things. The one is there's a kind of a pro-development discourse, but on a religious sphere there's also a very strong puritanical discourse that is promoted by these students. And they are the ones that are most articulate, they are much more clearer, and this is something that one finds in other parts of Africa as well. And I want to, so radio and television, I mean, it's also a kind of promotion of discourses about Islam. As I said, in conclusion, in this particular, what I want to say, a discourse about development, but also a discourse about religious renewal as such. I'm going to skip religious activism for a moment. Perhaps you can ask me. Here I am just briefly mention the fact that we've done a study that is still ongoing, that is looking at religious activists in a number of different parts of Africa. In particular, we identified Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. We started this project in 2010, but as you know, since at that time, both Egypt and Nigeria have become particularly difficult places to do research on. So the research is ongoing, but it has actually been slow. But the main idea, and perhaps I could just briefly share some of the findings for this. The main idea of studying religious activism was actually to look at individuals who are participating in religious groups, in political and religious groups, but actually study them from their own individual life trajectories, to see how they have moved from where they were until where they are now. And some of them we know have actually joined very radical groups, but others actually have joined, sometimes have become much more liberalized or much more secularized as such. What we thought of is look at the Muslim publics, but also look at individuals who actually can transform, to go through different kinds of conversions as such. But perhaps I could refer to that as well. I want to speak on a slightly different topic as such. I want to look at shrines. I'm connecting that to what I said about the radio stations in Ghana. Now the shrines are sites of intense debate and discussion, sometimes conflict in many different countries or many different communities in Africa. This particular shrine that you are seeing here is a shrine that is based at the foot of what is called Lion's Head, very near in Cape Town. A shrine that is said to be going back to one of the earlier founders of Islam in South Africa, in Cape Town, to the 17th century, during the Dutch period, or Dutch company period, I should say. Now, shrines have become contentious